Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Partners in Diversity's monthly Breakfast for Champions. My name is Tracy Lamb. I'm the Director of Programs and Communications. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. As you get settled, I wanted to share a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and will be sent to you after the event, along with the speaker's slide deck. The chat box is available. We ask that comments are courteous and respectful, and there will be time for Q&A with the speaker. Please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen to send the speaker your questions, and try not to use the chat box because we'll be mostly checking the Q&A box. And live captioning is also available. Here is a look now at some of our upcoming programs. This quarter, Say Hey takes place on February 9th in Hillsborough. It is the largest gathering of professionals of color in our region. This quarter's event is co-sponsored by the City of Hillsborough and Intel. It is free to attend, but space is limited and we are close to being selling out. So be sure to register soon. The registration link is being dropped in the chat box right now. And if you haven't heard, late last year, we launched a podcast series called Equity Conversations. The latest episode focuses on gaslighting and how it impacts DEI work. I hope you'll have a chance to check it out. The link to our podcast is also being posted in the chat box right now. And finally, pull out your calendar and save the date. September 26th will be our second biennial Northwest Equity Summit. It will feature amazing keynotes from award-winning author of The Wake Up, Michelle Mi-Jung Kim, and Caroline Wanga, CEO of Essence, a consumer technology company dedicated to Black women and people of color. She also used to be the CDO and VP of HR at Target. Registration isn't open yet, but sponsorship opportunities are available. Reach out if you are interested. And as always, you have any questions about any of the programs I just mentioned, feel free to message me or anyone else at Partners in Diversity. Now, I want to introduce our Executive Director, Mari Watanabe. Mari?
Hey, good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well this morning as we wake up to yet another gun-related tragedy that has affected our communities across the country. Please be sure to take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for being here. Each of our organizations is on a different part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Wherever you are in the journey, an inclusive recruitment process is one aspect of it. You may know that Partners in Diversity hosts an online jobs board we call the Career Center. As we have learned at previous Breakfast for Champions programs, having an inclusive job description and pay transparency are just the beginning of the hiring process. In our program today, we will look at yet another piece, the interview. We focus on the keys to inclusive interviewing that will make a difference. Throughout this year's Breakfast for Champions program, we will also discuss inclusive onboarding and performance management, all ways to help your organization retain diverse talent. To lead us in this morning's discussion, we are excited to bring back Elizabeth Laine. You may remember her from her very popular sessions on measuring inclusion and operationalizing DEI. Elizabeth is head of DEI and talent development at Clearway Energy. She formerly spearheaded DEI work at the boutique consulting firm called Lead Inclusively Inc., where she developed strategic roadmaps for dozens of companies globally. At RevWork.ai, Elizabeth used cutting-edge nudge technology to influence learning and behavior change at scale. Elizabeth's work has earned her many accolades, including winner of the National Diversity Council's National Latino Leadership Award. That's a mouthful, but congratulations, Elizabeth. So please welcome back to Partners in Diversity, Elizabeth Laine.
Thank you, Mari. It's wonderful to be here with everyone. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Well, hello. I love coming to these Breakfast for Champions events and all of Partners in Diversity's events. Such high quality content and so many really thoughtful leaders who are really engaged in this work of DEI. So let's dive in. Today, our topic is inclusive interviewing. I'm going to share an approach to inclusive interviewing that has had a really dramatic impact on the way that my company, Clearway Energy, hires and on our demographic results, which in under 18 months has helped us to increase our hiring of individuals from groups that have been historically underinvested in by 62%. That's a big increase, and our retention rates are also up over 30%. Correlation doesn't equal causation. There's a lot of other work that's happening and that has happened to get us to this point, but I absolutely credit our approach to interviewing with a big part of this success. So I'm hopeful that you're able to take what is helpful to you and your organizations from this discussion. And I'm going to share some of the ways that we have created this impact. So we're going to talk through the challenge we're facing and just some of the complicating factors in the landscape related to inclusive interviewing and hiring. We're going to talk about specific keys to inclusive interviewing, which we'll get to here briefly in a moment. And we'll talk about how to implement a process like this, how to actually take the concept and translate it into practice in a really meaningful way, and how to measure that change over time. Primarily now, these keys are process oriented. If you have listened to me speak before, you know that I'm really big on changing systems. And so organizationally, this is really about how we can impact the interviewing and hiring process in an organization in order to make it a more inclusive experience and a more objective experience. So if you're an individual who maybe doesn't have direct oversight or input to the process of hiring and interviewing, and rather, perhaps as an interviewer yourself, don't worry, there's a section that will be helpful from an individual tactical perspective, but primarily this is focused on organizational change, So we'll discuss and engage throughout. Feel free to ask questions through the Q&A over the course of our time, and I'll check that Q&A box as we go through. And before we get into the meat of this discussion, I'd love to get an idea for where you currently feel your organization has some needs. So I'm going to launch a poll here. And the question is, of the following options, which are the 2 top challenges in your organization? This is just a curiosity question for me. I would love to know which of the aspects I'll be talking about today to really spend a little bit more focused time on and to be thoughtful about addressing, if there's one specifically or 2 specifically that we should really be looking at in more detail. Those votes are rolling in. Fantastic. I'll give you just a couple more seconds to get your answers in here. All right. We got over 85% participation, so I'll go ahead and close out and show you what the options, just hit 90%. Okay, so overall, attracting and retaining diverse candidates are the top 2 options by quite a bit. And then an inconsistently applied hiring process looks like it's 3rd. And so thank you for sharing that. I'm going to be talking today about all of those things, but largely about how the process that we use to interview really shapes the type of candidates that come into our pipeline and who stay in the organization over time based on the quality of the process itself. So let's start with the challenge. As with many things, the challenge that we identify and that we can see, lack of inclusion or lack of representation in our organizations, to whatever degree it exists, it's really a symptom of a deeper challenge. I really believe we rise and fall based on our people, and nothing we do is more important than hiring people and developing people and investing in those people inclusively so they maximize their potential and really feel connected to a sense of purpose and of meaning and belonging. At the end of the day, you bet on people and not just on strategies. And there are a lot of challenges in the process of interviewing. we understand the challenge of being inclusive in this process, and beyond that, there's often a time crunch to try and fill an open role where we don't really have the luxury of sitting back and interrogating fully our approach to hiring and interviewing. Are we doing this the best we can? Are we really being intentional and thoughtful? So we're doing that today. We're taking this time, we're giving ourselves permission to sit back and consider how we run this process in a way that we get the results that we really want. How we run this very expensive process, actually. Have you ever stopped to figure out exactly how much time you have to invest in hiring an employee? It's a lot. Activities like screening phone calls, reviewing resumes, arranging interviews, these are really time consuming. And the amount of money that time represents, along with the amount of money that's being lost due to lack of productivity and not having someone in the role, right? The amount of money lost in terms of everyone's time involved in the interviewing and sourcing process. Wow, it really adds up. And I'm curious if you know what percentage of an employee's salary it can cost to replace the average full-time knowledge worker. Percentage of that person's salary. I just launched a poll. Get your answers in, and we'll see where we land. You all are very fast at getting your answers in here. We're already at 90% answered. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share your thoughts out here. Answers vary. We've got everything from 35% to 200% here represented. And it's a little bit of a trick question because there are figures that range between that 50% mark and the 200% mark. But for most organizations, those annual costs are in the millions annually, right? There are a lot of factors that can complicate that, but it's expensive regardless. So, even in a best case scenario, it's expensive. And that's if you get a great response to your first job description. The first person you interview ends up being an incredible candidate. They accept a job offer immediately. They get started right away. They work out long term. It's still really expensive. And in most cases, that's not actually how it works. So, aside from the self-evident aspect that those of us in this room are wholly committed to DEI being in every piece of business, there's also the dollars and cents aspect to consider that says we don't have the luxury of making a poor choice. We want to use the most objective method to most inclusively determine the best person for this job, and we have to do it right. And we have to do it right the first time. So are organizations investing major resources that reflect that significance into creating excellent interviewing processes? By and large, the answer really is no. Next poll. Which of the following is the worst way to make hiring decisions? There are a lot of ways that our organizations try to decide who is the best person for this role, who should we bring into our organization. There's talent assessments, there's past performance evaluation, there's work samples or sort of like job audition style reviews. There's structured interviews, there's standard unstructured interviews. There are a lot of different ways that we try to figure out and sort of fortune tell and understand who's the right person to bring in for our roles. And all of the data shows us that the worst way to evaluate talent is, as everyone said overwhelmingly here, standard job interview. Social scientists have argued in vain for years that the standard open-ended, conversational, unstructured interview does essentially nothing to improve the quality of the candidates that are selected. As long ago as the early 80s, there were studies that showed that unstructured interviews had the same level of predictive success as a coin flip. 10 years ago, there was a study that suggested that unstructured interviews actually harm the ability to select the right people. There are so many studies on this, but I chose to feature this one because I got such a kick out of the title, Belief in the Unstructured Interview, the Persistence of an Illusion. For this paper, published in the Journal of Judgment and Decision Making, there was a test of whether unstructured interviews might actually interfere in people's ability to predict applicants' performance. So the study participants were asked to predict two individuals' performance. One was evaluated based on details about their past performance and no discussion with the candidate. And then the other person was evaluated based on details about the past performance plus an unstructured interview where they got to ask questions. And then in a further twist, those who were being interviewed were told sometimes to answer the questions truthfully, and others were told to answer according to a system that randomized their responses, essentially meaning that the interview produced nothing of value. The subjects worried that their interviewers would notice this disconnect, and yet that never happened. In fact, the study's subjects found both the truthful and the random answers to be informative. And no matter what, conducting an unstructured interview led the subjects to make worse predictions than working only from the information that they had on paper. So unstructured or conversational style interviews are objectively speaking about the worst way to make a hiring decision. And yet 95% of companies use these style of interviews as their primary method of evaluating job candidates. Additionally, almost 40% of hiring professionals have never received any training on hiring. And one of the things that we see is one of the challenges here of unstructured interviewing is that we see it unfairly advantages people who are charismatic and people who maybe are not necessarily top performers. Now, hear me out on that, because we see that about 33% of employers determine if they will hire a candidate or not. Not necessarily, I will hire this person, but whether or not they would consider the person for the role within the first 90 seconds. So they're disqualifying people very, very rapidly. And this unfairly advantages people who are more charismatic, and top performers, don't always necessarily interview well. Interviewing is a skill, and they don't interview often. Whereas job hoppers are professional interviewers and oftentimes do have the capacity to make those quick connections and create an environment where a hiring manager might feel more positively inclined towards them. The reality is that regardless of kind of what piece of information is being most weighted in this evaluation, hiring managers are making their decisions in an unstructured interview in inconsistent ways. And so what we want to do is infuse objectivity into that process. So 5 keys to more inclusive interviewing. The way that we would like to see this happen, and we'll get into more of this here in a moment, but we want to target process as opposed to people. We want to use structured interviews, and I'm going to get into details on what that really means, how it differs from a standard interview, what you actually do in order to implement something like that, how to get buy-in in an organization. We'll get into all of that. You want to evaluate objectively. You want to train data validators, essentially people who can act as bias spotters in this process. And you want to measure and set goals. So we'll get into each of those pieces of the puzzle here now. And the first piece of that puzzle, if you know anything about me, you know that I love the process work. And in order to make organizational changes, we really need to target process as opposed to people. So it's harder to change people than processes. It's harder to change people than systems. Many organizations have given hiring managers and interviewers some kind of unconscious bias training related to hiring, and yet they still struggle to see the kind of change that they'd like to see in the process. And the truth of the matter is, habits are hard to break. We have oftentimes ways that we've been interviewing for years, and it's hard to make significant changes over the long term. And there's a lot of research that shows that training alone, mandatory unconscious bias trainings alone, do not really do much to change long-term actions. So we can give people information, but until we create a process that's really going to support implementing that information into action, we really struggle. And so for those who are brought in, translating training to consistent application can be really challenging, even if you're totally bought in on that. And for those who are not totally bought in, we can see a result of backlash, especially if that training isn't action oriented. So don't misunderstand. I'm not saying backlash is a reason not to do something, right? We're going to do the right thing here. I'm simply saying understanding where we can end up in a logjam in our approach to this and proactively protecting against those risks are just one of many ways that we can promote our desired outcomes. So when we're starting to think about this, when we're starting to talk to people about the changes we want to make, when we're starting to try to socialize this in the organization, we really want to talk about process. Even for positively inclined people, immunity to change is a really deep-seated and often unconscious reality. People are really strongly motivated to self-protect. And I highly recommend the work of Dr. Robert Kegan, Kegan, on the topic of immunity to change. There's a gap between a person's real intention to do something different and what the person actually does. There is a study of heart doctors who advise their patients to take their medications as prescribed, or they will literally die. And yet in follow-up research, only 1 out of 7 actually take their medications. The other 6 have just as great a desire to stay alive, and they yet risk death by not following their doctor's orders. And so Dr. Kegan does some remarkable analysis on this study, but he proposes this concept that there's a deep need for some internal ways of thinking about what is in the way between a person's genuine intention and what the person is actually able to do in reality, So, when you challenge ideas that people have of the way that they work, the way that they interview, the way that they are evaluating people, the gut reaction may be to sense something that is a threat to their self, to their self-esteem, to their competence, to their sense of inherent goodness, even if there is conscious agreement intellectually with the concept. So what can appear at first glance to be some knee-jerk defensiveness, for example, that really through a more compassionate lens becomes our universal desire to be seen as good and competent. And so if we as leaders can create a process that protects these core needs while we come together to make change, we can create DEI initiatives that are really successful, especially in an area where we have so many different people in the organization who are responsible for outcomes, as in hiring. What do I mean by this? This is really about addressing process as flawed rather than people as flawed. So if we're looking at a people-focused problem, we're framing this as, biased hiring managers are only bringing in candidates that look like themselves. That's why we have a lack of diversity in terms of race or gender in our organization. So we need all our hiring managers to go through training to address their biases. That message says you're not being fair, you're not competent to hire the right people, you're doing it wrong, you're not empathetic, that the person themselves has a deficiency. Whereas if we're talking about a process-focused problem statement, we're saying the hiring process doesn't have consistent guidelines or expectations. There's such a burden on hiring managers who are unable to create a consistent experience for our candidates. And we need to create systems that are going to support our hiring managers to ensure that we can be as objective as possible in this process. So there's a big difference in the way that people can receive and respond to that message. So regardless of the truth of the matter, that of course everyone has bias, right? The messaging itself can either push forward our ability to be effective in implementing a process like this, or it can create some blockers that we need to address before we can get to the point of being able to actually implement the process change. And people change follows process change. So what does targeting systems look like? Well, what we want to do is create a situation where the change we want to promote is as easy to implement as possible. And the best way to do that is to own the systemic inequities that exist and allow people to be part of a systemic solution. So we want to collect data. We want to diagnose the specific inequities in the organization. We might discover what is an issue, why that's an issue, how it is an issue, and then gather some data around that. And then, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, put that together in a meaningful way and communicate about initiatives using a systems-focused framing. We found these issues. We see that they're traced back to this inconsistent process, and we're going to bring our people in to help us fix that process and give people responsibility for helping to uphold that process. And then as we're making these efforts to change, we want to appeal to fairness. We want to clearly lay out expectations for change alongside resources and support. We can't ask people to make a change without equipping them with everything they need to be successful. And then we want to sustain momentum by measuring progress, affirming effort, and celebrating wins. And I say all of this to sort of frame up this conversation because in many scenarios, I've gone into organizations and had conversations that, we need to be more inclusive and we need to be more unbiased in our evaluation of people. And that is absolutely true. And the way that we get the most buy-in for that is framing that as a systems problem that people can be enlisted to help fix systemically. Okay, so this is the point at which I will give us a moment to check out some questions and comments, and then move on to the second key, which is implementing a structured interview. How do we actually do that? And what does that really mean? So we're going to go to the Q&A, several questions about presentation slides. Yes, the slide deck will be shared. Okay, we believe in and have seen the power of structured interviews. We've used them for years. However, even when we have been upfront about doing this as part of our equitable hiring process, we've gotten negative feedback from candidates that it feels cold and lacks personal connection. How do you recommend responding to this? Oh, we're going to address this. Yes, great question. What is the difference between standard and structured interviewing by definition? We'll get to that in just a second. How do you convince an organization to move away from standard interviews? In addition to the data, I'm also going to present some materials that will hopefully help you do that. And let's see, does the effectiveness of interviewing change for internal versus external hiring? I would say it becomes even more important in an internal situation or in any situation where you have history or background with the candidate. So you have external factors that could influence the decision that's being made, becomes increasingly important to make sense of that. Okay. Implementing structured interviews. So like I said before, the challenge, which might appear to be a lack of representation, for example, is really a symptom of something deeper, which is the process challenge. And as you know, the beautiful thing about process is that every process is perfectly engineered to produce the results that it gets. Meaning, if we don't like the results, we can go back into the process and re-engineer it so that it turns out the results that we want. And so the work of this re-engineering as it relates to structured interviews is really about creating clarity and transparency and accountability in a place where largely in our organizations, it does not exist. So what exactly is the difference between a structured and an unstructured interview? Unstructured interviews are those interviews when you come into an organization, you sit down to talk to somebody and they say, we're just going to have a chat. I like to be informal. So it unfolds like a conversation. There may be a couple of general topics to cover. There's not any specific questions that were maybe preset in advance. Maybe a couple of those will come up throughout the course of the conversation, but it really is more like a conversation. There's not necessarily a preset order of questions, et cetera, et cetera. So in a structured interview, we're looking at something that is very different. We have preset questions designed in advance we will focus on the core competencies of the role, and we'll ask questions that are specifically based on those core competencies, which means that there's some pre-work to do. The interviewer knows what to look for from each question, so can judge the quality of a response. Questions are asked in the same order for each candidate. So every candidate answers the same questions in the same order. It mostly consists of behavioral and situational questions. So as opposed to more of a conversational style interview, which can end up being kind of hypothetical when responses are given, this is very much like, what have you done in the past, or how do you handle this, or tell me about a time when. They can go off script. So this gets to that point of like, this feels really cold and robotic. They can go off script. You can ask follow-up questions, frame questions in a meaningful way. So you can say, if the question is, let's say, tell me about a time when you had to collaborate with a big group of people across many functions in an organization for an important project, and how did that go? How did you do that? You can, instead of just saying, tell me about a time when you had to collaborate, right, which can be very cold and impersonal and robotic, you can back up and give some context. Like in this role, there are a lot of different scenarios where you'll need to interface with executives and frontline employees in order to make your projects effectively come together. So I'd love to hear about a time when you were able to collaborate across many different levels in the organization. Give a little context. Why are you asking this question? How does it relate to the role? It's not just a robotic asking the question for each candidate. You can be human in that scenario, but the questions will always be the same, and you'll always come back to those same questions. So remember the study I mentioned earlier, where unstructured interviews harmed the interviewer's ability to predict success. They actually made it more ineffective. In that same study, researchers found that adding structure to an interview by asking a set list of questions and coming up with a specific rubric for assessing those questions dramatically increased the validity of the information gathered. In the studies, the standardized approach always outperforms the traditional interview. Research shows that structured interviews can be predictive of candidate performance, even for jobs that are themselves unstructured. And they are over 2 times more effective at identifying candidates for a role than unstructured interviews. So instead of a general conversation that flows organically, in my organization at Clearway Energy, we have a much more structured process. We take pains to understand every job, to articulate what are the competencies required to do those jobs well, and use that as the baseline for asking a question related to those competencies. So every question in our interview protocol is tied to a competence that we know that you need to excel in that specific role. And then we make sure that if I interview 5 people for a role, let's say all 5 answer the exact same questions in the exact same order. And so candidates who come in can rest assured that they are being judged against an objective, predefined standard that is the same for every candidate. And by and large, candidates actually prefer that approach because there's confidence that that the decisions that are being made are not capricious. So interviewing is an inherently biased process. It's hard because people individually are looking at candidates and evaluating them by their own standards. And so the goal is to structurally reduce as much of that as possible. So I really advocate for using structured interviews. The big picture on this is you're going to use those same preset high quality questions relevant to the role for every candidate. You're going to record comprehensive feedback on candidate answers so that evaluators can review responses. That's how you start finding out things like, oh, strange, this candidate gave the same example to every interviewer for a variety of different questions. Maybe that person doesn't have the depth of experience that we sort of thought might have been the case initially. Something like that comes to the surface. You'll score with a standardized rubric, so all interviewers have a shared understanding of what is a poor response, what's a mediocre response, what is a exceeds expectations type response. and you provide education and training so interviewers can be consistent over time. And this is just big picture stuff. This is what needs to be present in any standardized interview. So interviewing as a process really can be skewed by so many factors, and the goal is to structurally reduce as much subjectivity as possible. So based on this, you should have the information to answer this next poll question, which is a true or false question. A work sample paired with a standard interview is a better way to predict future performance than a work sample alone. True or false? So which is more effective, just having a work sample or a work sample plus an interview, standard interview? We'll give it a moment. Couple more seconds. I'm seeing your responses coming in. All right, sharing the results now. And it looks like you're pretty split on this one. So this goes back to the study results that I mentioned earlier, saying that that interviewers were asked to evaluate candidates based, and their prediction for their future success was based on either just work sample and past performance information, or work sample plus a standard interview. And in the work sample plus the standard interview, you get worse outcomes than simply looking at past performance or work sample. So what we see is that even though it might appear that we're gathering more data in that scenario, if the data gathering is not standardized, the quality of that data is really low. So we want the data that we gather to be really standardized and consistent across the entire organization. So in practice, what do we need to do here? We need to align job descriptions to core competencies and create question categories for those competencies. So from a structural process perspective, this means some work. This is one of the reasons that organizations don't use structured interviews as much, because there is a little bit of work on the front end to make that happen. You're going to focus on behavioral and situational questions. So tell me about a time when, or what happened in the past when this, when you were in a certain scenario. You're going to create and consistently use a detailed objective rubric. I'll show you an example in a moment. The core questions will be asked, will be not just predetermined, but they will be assigned. So every interviewer will have a role or an area of focus. You're going to be asking these questions. Here's the competence that you're assigned to investigate. Here's the topic that you're going to be the person who is going to be detailing for us. So each interview actually has a role and a job. And take notes in a shared form and grade each individual's responses on their quality, either in real time or as soon as possible. At Clearway, what we do is we actually have a shared document where every interviewer's name is written down and the questions that they're going to ask are listed out. And then there's a space for notes on the response for each question and a space for each interviewer to grade the quality of that response. So grading the quality of the response is going to be based on, factors such as the, the experience that the person can bring to the role based on their response. Did they have a really detailed response, or was it more hypothetical? Was it an actual situation that they were responsible for, or were they part of a team? Did they kind of swirl around and make something up sort of, or did they have a very concrete response? And were they able to think of more than one example? These are different things that can increase the quality of the response. And sure, there's going to be some level of subjectivity in saying, yeah, that was a great response versus that wasn't a great response. But over time, as you see multiple candidates answering those same questions, you'll be able to see the higher quality responses rise to the surface. And one of the things that that does is it allows us to be able to have sleeper candidates almost. You know, instead of having a candidate that comes to mind as, oh, this is my top candidate, and then you start discussing with them their strengths and focusing on that because you're excited about it and you know they can bring something to the role with those strengths. And then other candidates maybe have a heavier burden of proof because you're asking them questions that are designed to not just identify strengths, but also probe for weaknesses. And you don't do that with your top candidate because you're excited about certain things. This process actually allows you to be in a situation like one that I found myself in, which is I saw someone who I really liked. I thought that person was my top candidate. Over the course of several interviews, I and my fellow interviewers realized that there was a candidate who was slowly starting to rise to the top with consistent, really high quality answers. Over time, they were just showing more and more of their strengths and skills. And that person ended up being the person who got the role and has worked out amazingly for us. And I can see so many situations where that person would never have gotten the chance over time to demonstrate their strength as a candidate because we might have counted them out because they didn't have a strong performance in one scenario, for example. But overall, their strength over time starts to rise to the top as we have a more structured approach that gives equal weight to all of the different aspects we're evaluating. And you know that allows us to be a little bit more objective about the way that we're looking at each candidate. All right. Next section. So we've got the structured interview. We've got our questions. We've got our interviewers who are all using this same structured interview approach. And the next thing that we want to do is to increase objectivity in the evaluation process. So we're gathering data based on structured questions. Now we want to evaluate that data. So structured interviewing, this really solves for a lot of different things. I want to show those of you who are asking, how do you sort of make a case for this to your organizations beyond just the preponderance of evidence that shows structured interviews are a much higher quality way to make decisions, but it also solves for a lot of different things here. So the first thing is that it solves for disorganized or conversational interviews that are not targeted enough. And despite the comment that we got a little bit earlier, the data shows that overall candidates rate structured interviews more favorably than other selection methods. In my own experience, I interviewed once for a global role, a very senior role in a large company. And I was one of the final two candidates. And when they reached out to me, I did not get the role. And they told me this was a really difficult decision. We had to go back to our job description with your profile and the other candidate's profile and tick things off for each of you until we got way deep into our nitty-gritty like-to-haves where the other candidate just edged you out. And do you know what? As a candidate, that felt great. That is a really defensible response. Instead of like, oh, we just felt the other candidate was stronger. Well, what does that tell me? How do I take on board that kind of feedback? As a candidate, that's really ineffective feedback. And when a candidate hears, we went through all of our requirements and all of our nice to haves. And finally, we found that the other candidate had more of the things that we had listed out here. That's a really structured, defensible sort of response. So that's one example. The other is it solves for personality interviews that advantage a charismatic person or a job hopper. So it ensures that interviewers are evaluating both strengths and challenge areas and allows time for candidates to prove themselves and rise to the top, as I mentioned in that one example. I've been in another situation where I was interviewing for a similar role, When they reached out to me, I actually had 2 job offers on the table, and they put me through 6 rounds of interviews and got me a job offer in less than a week. Every single one of those interviews was so conversational and unstructured. I rejected that offer because I could not join an organization that would make decisions on who to bring into the company so capriciously. And it worked for me because I managed to, have a good rapport with those interviewers and have a good conversation. But at the end of each interview, I really felt like this person doesn't actually know what my skills or capabilities are. They have no idea based on our conversation. And that worked for me in that situation in terms of that they liked me enough to want to bring me on board. But that's a really bad way to make a decision. And so personality interview is oftentimes what many people are doing when they'll say, oh yeah, I thought so-and-so would be a great fit. And we want to make sure that we're not doing that. It solves for interviewers asking the same questions. This can cause a really poor candidate experience. I've heard this so many times where candidates will say, like, I went through 5 different job interviews and half the people asked me the same questions. They just seemed really disorganized, and it just creates a poor company image. So that's certainly one thing that having a structured set of questions can solve for. It also solves for lack of transparency across interviews. And lack of transparency into answers across interviews, like that example I gave a moment ago, where the candidate will use the same couple of examples for every interview to provide an answer to every single question. And then, you don't necessarily have the depth of experience there, or the quality of response that you would be looking for the person that you might want to hire for, let's say, even a mid-level position. And then it also solves for some degree of interviewer bias and that 90-second disqualification that we talked about earlier. So this is a much more robust way to make a decision when we have a very structured response. And I would love to hear from you. Let me launch this last poll here. Why don't companies, if this is the case, if a structured interview is much higher quality, if the response is so much better in terms of the data that we get, if it solves for so many consistent concerns across organizations, then why don't more companies use a more standardized process for interviewing? And some of you have sort of alluded to this in some of the comments that you've made, but which of these things seems like the reason to you? You're all so fast on these responses. Just a couple more seconds here. All right. Ending the poll here, sharing results. And these are all valid reasons that organizations might feel are reasons to stay away from structured interviews. These are true. There is a high level of effort to develop them. If people are not well trained in conducting those interviews, they can come across as impersonal. Some people may feel that they have a great team and they've been doing unstructured interviews for their whole career, so this is pointless. That is a feeling that many people have. There might be a lack of alignment between job descriptions and the competencies, so that we don't have a basis for even determining what questions we'd like to ask. That is true in many organizations. So all of these reasons may come across as very valid reasons for an organization to say, this is too much effort for us, and we don't know that we're going to get what we want out of it. But the reality is, that all of the data that we have shows that standardized interviewing processes are the best way to make decisions that we have that involve an interview. So the other thing we want to do here is reduce, we want to ensure that we're reducing the bias that comes through in language. So we might talk about, good culture fit, but for success in structured interviews with relation to culture, we want two things. Number one, we want our culture carriers to be our champions. Culture carriers are the people who, regardless of their position, have an outsized influence on the organizational culture. So, in our organization, some of those people might be administrative staff. Those people have a tremendous influence on the way that people feel about showing up to work, and are our culture carriers, and we value their input and ask them to come into the room to understand what we're doing with these different things and to share their thoughts and to act as champions for these in their roles, regardless of where they sit in the organization. Their impact, whether that is, griping about something and their frustration sort of carrying through the organization, or being excited about things. And that excitement allows people to give something a shot that maybe otherwise they would feel a little hesitant about. We want to enlist the culture carriers to support us. And then the second thing is we want to ensure that we are structuring our scoring rubric to evaluate for culture add as opposed to culture fit. If we say culture fit, language is so powerful. We might be saying, is this person a culture fit? Is this person somehow in some way the same as the people we already have here? And so subconsciously penalizing those who may not be. So those candidates that we would be hoping to bring into the organization can have, in some ways, sort of a mark against them if we're using the language of culture fit. Culture add asks, how does this person bring something new to the organization or to the team? And automatically frames that as a positive thing. So we want to ensure that we're hiring in a way that we are building our desired culture. How does this person add to our culture so that we're progressing toward where we want to be? We also want to look at values alignment as an aspect of culture add, which also creates a basis for people who are not values aligned to leave the organization, which is to our long-term benefit. And for us all to screen for values alignment in that hiring process. Okay, so we are asking everyone the same questions. We are being rigorous about our notes and our evaluation. Here's what a rubric for this can look like. Do not panic. This is not actually as complex as it looks. What you do here, I know this looks overwhelming. What you do is you will have let's say an Excel form or something like that. And each interviewer will write their notes for the candidates and so on. And the interview matrix itself here will pull information from that form. So it would pull the interviewers' names, you would have all the candidates, and then based on the notes and the scoring and the grading of the candidate answers, it would pull information into this matrix. So you will actually have each interviewer and candidate, and you will see a score. In this rating scale, it's 0 to 3. 0 does not meet qualifications, to 3, which is exceeds qualifications or requirements for the role. And then you'll have a total by each area. So you'll have capabilities questions, and then you'll have competency questions. Maybe for this one, it's we need personal agility, we need continuous improvement, we need leadership and management skills, we need communication skills. So the score that's given to that candidate by each interviewer will get pulled into here, and it will add them up. So you will also have a space here to evaluate for culture add. Does this person bring us something new to the organization? And the nice thing is that all of these are things that we want for each of our candidates. And we also don't have an opportunity to weight any of them unequally. So where you might end up with a halo bias, for example, where you have somebody whose, let's say, personal agility or communication skills outshines other people's, they will get full points. Maybe they'll get three points for that. They exceed the qualifications you would want someone to have in terms of communication skills, but it only counts for communication skills. You can't have, in a matrix like this, you can't have communication skills that cancel out basically the score of everything else, if that's their only strength. So these are weighted evenly, and you can weight them differently, specifically with regard to certain capabilities for the job, for example. Maybe you want that to be different. But at the end of the day, this matrix itself pulls in all of the information and calculates a score for each candidate. And right here, you would see those total scores for the candidates, and it would show you clearly who has the highest score. Now, that being said, it is not a requirement necessarily that, every single time you hire the candidate who has the highest score. Especially if you have a few people who are very, very close together, like within a point of each other, 2 points maybe. You might want to look at culture add and use that as somewhat of a tie break, or maybe somebody has a specific experience that when you go back into that job description and go down that list and get into those nice to haves, you find something that ends up being a tie break for somebody who, let's say, was a point behind the actual points leader. Right? There's still a small degree of subjectivity in this, but the important thing is that using a matrix like this will actually allow you to think objectively about what the decision is that you're making and for what reasons, and it will point out to you instances where your own bias might be in play, such as in the case that I gave an example of where I experienced an affinity bias and really liked somebody right away. Using this matrix showed that someone else was a stronger candidate by far, and it was very easy to say, wow, this candidate really should be the correct choice for this position. So this is an example of what you would want your scoring matrix to look like in some respect. So making sure that you're able to evaluate each candidate effectively. Now we're seeing some questions in the chat here about how do you objectively evaluate culture add. That's going to be specific to your organization. What is the culture that you're trying to build? Hopefully, you have already identified specific values, specific inclusive behaviors that your organization finds to be in alignment with its ideal culture. Hopefully, you have a really clear definition for that within your own organization. And so that can be specific to your own organization. So it would not be the same from organization to organization, but it should be clear in each organization. I'm also seeing some questions about, let's see, a lot of people are asking about whether interview questions should be provided to candidates. I do not think interview questions need to be provided to candidates at all. And the reason is that we have no data to suggest that that's an important thing. The only scenario where that could potentially be something that we want to do is in a scenario where somebody has a need for a reasonable accommodation. That is definitely a situation where perhaps on a case-by-case basis, you might look at that, depending on what the reasonable accommodation might be. However, generally, we don't provide that to the candidate. What we do provide is a sheet that will help people to understand what to expect from our interview process and what we're evaluating for. We will evaluate for specific competencies that are important to the role. We want to ensure that everyone who comes into the organization is values aligned with our company. For us, that means has an inclusive perspective, or has a continuous improvement mindset, you can specifically say some of those things. You can say, we also want to ensure that people who come into our organization have XYZ specific requirements in this role. We can spell some of that out and say, here's what we're looking for. We'll be asking everyone the same questions so that we can evaluate fairly from person to person. Here's how the process goes. You'll get a 15-minute screen with the recruiter. You'll get a half-hour conversation with the hiring manager. And then depending on the results of those conversations, then you will have 2 one-hour interviews with 2 two-person panels. And then you'll hear back from the recruiter within 5 to 7 days. We provide a lot of clarity on what does the process look like? What are we looking for broadly? What can you expect? We'll do a Zoom interview. We'll do a Teams interview. Make sure that you're in a place with good lighting and with a good internet connection. All of that stuff, absolutely. Provide your candidates with the information needed in order to feel confident and like they know what to expect from the experience, but they don't specifically need to know the exact questions that will be asked. So yes, to the earlier quiz, companies don't use this because of the development effort, for one thing. You have to align those job descriptions with the competencies. You have to rate your questions. You have to train your interviewers. You have to create accountability structures. You have to evaluate how effective you're being. You need to optimize over time. It is definitely an investment. Additionally, interviewers want to establish a personal connection. That's one of the big reasons that unstructured interviews still have such a hold over our organizations, as interviewers actually believe that they're great at interviewing. And that's a little bit of an ego thing, honestly. I want to feel like I'm great at interviewing. I want to feel like I can intuit who's going to be the right person for a role. And that's just a human impulse. Interviewers really do believe that they're great at interviewing. However, all of the data that we have says that we can't really trust our guts as far as predicting future performance. And when we have a gut feeling about a candidate, that's bias at work. So especially during first encounters, we make assumptions. And my favorite assumption or bias is I'm not biased. The I'm not biased bias, in which people believe that they are more objective than others. So the more structure and objectivity we can infuse into the process itself, instead of expecting that people inherently will be able to be more objective, which they won't be, the more we can do that, the faster and easier it is on the back end, despite that front end effort, to really filter people appropriately and to have a lot of clarity and transparency in our process around why we're making the decisions we're making. Okay, questions and comments. Got a lot of questions happening here, so I'm going to go through and see what some of those questions are. Is there best practice for how we write interview notes? Third person, close to verbatim. I want to major in the majors and minor in the minors. Majoring in the majors means implementing a really clear structured process. How you take those interview notes is up to you and not something that I would focus on. I would try to include certain quotes from them or specific examples that they give so that they will spark your memory when you come back to this, but it's not something I think that should be a focus until after all of the structured aspects are implemented effectively. Let's see. Do you have a sample of your breakdown of what will happen during the interview? I do not one I can share right now, at least. However, I do know that there are a lot of those online. If you look up like candidate interview letters or candidate interview details, things like that, you'll see a good deal of information and samples and things like that that you could use. Let's see. Applicants are often nervous when they begin an interview, so asking clarifying questions seems to assist in reducing their anxiety so that they provide more in-depth answers. Yeah, absolutely. I agree that you can ask clarifying questions as much as you like, or continue to probe for additional details on an example, something like that. But then you come back to those core questions. So again, it doesn't have to be robotic or impersonal, but you do have a mission, and the mission is to make sure that you're answering specific questions. Let's see. Okay. To avoid bias, we try to move away from groupthink and let people form their opinions on their own. Can you talk more about taking notes in a shared form and the value of that? Yeah, I also agree that we want to make sure that people can form their own perspectives. One of the things that is interesting about using the shared form is every interviewer is asking different questions. So those questions are assigned, and interviewers aren't asking the same questions. So you can see what the responses were, but it's less about, so the notes are about the candidate's responses. The grading of those responses is private. So you should be able to see what the candidate said to certain questions, but not necessarily how that candidate's response was evaluated. Is there best practice for the number of rounds of interviews or style of interviews, like screening interview with team members, 2 to 3 people, and then follow up with a panel interview, 4 to 5 people versus individual interviews? At Clearway, we, for roles, for the majority of roles, meaning let's say up to director level, we do 3 interviews or 4 interviews at the most. We'll do the screen, we'll do a hiring manager interview, we'll do 2 panel interviews with only 2 individuals as interviewers, because we find that more than that makes it really difficult to actually have a meaningful discussion with a candidate. And then when we get up higher in the ranks of the organization, we do have some additional interviews, but typically it's going to be 4 interviews. So we try to get through it pretty quickly, and it's much more effective when you are really structured and specific about what you're going to be asking. So you can actually move a lot quicker once you know exactly what you're doing in the process. Okay. Let's see. There's a lot of how many interviews, do you share questions? I addressed those. Let's see. Does everybody grade each interview question or just their assigned question? They only grade their own assigned question. How do you efficiently and effectively educate or train interviewers? We have a very small team, and we are responsible for many efforts beyond recruitment. This year, we have at least 14 hires on the books and only so much time to interface with each team. What we do is we have a 2-hour training that we put all of our interviewers through. It's interactive, it's live. And we just do that once a year. So it's actually pretty time efficient. All right. Other questions I'm seeing? I think we're getting most of them. All right. So we're going to go ahead and move forward here. And just really quickly, because I know we are getting toward the end of our time, the next key is to train data validators, which I think of informally as bias spotters, but truly their role is validating the information that people are making their decisions based on. So you've created a structured process. You've created a robust rubric. You're getting your hiring managers and interviewing teams up to speed on the process-based reasons that this is valuable. And then now what? Train, double down, and appoint people to act as bias spotters. You don't have to call it bias spotting. You can call it whatever you want. but this really is what it is. And the core is not that you have this army of people who know how to name every single kind of bias, but it is that you have people who can identify assumptions. That's truly the core. So bias spotters would be folks who are trained to see thin reasoning and assumptions, and then to ask questions that refocus a discussion. It's really about asking, it's really about asking really good questions that are going to refocus a conversation and bring people back to basics. So questions could be things like, how do we know that? Does this matter to this person's ability to do the job? Should we be deciding against someone based on non-work related reasons? Is there another way to interpret that information? Who's a better cultural ad? Who brings something to this team that we don't have? And asking these kinds of questions to sort of refocus the interview is really important. People who can be trained in this work include your talent acquisition team, HR business partners, maybe DEI council representatives, members of employee resource groups who would like to participate in that, specific hiring managers who have an interest. And this is in addition to training that all hiring managers should receive. This is somebody who's going to be really, really able to focus a conversation and ask these questions more specifically. Okay. These are some of the most common interviewing biases. I'm sure you're all familiar. There's the affinity bias, where you prefer individuals who are similar to you. That's that 90-second decision. Oh, I like this person, we gel, we click. There's a confirmation bias, where we might be looking out for information to confirm assumptions, where you unintentionally might end up asking your top candidate questions that highlight their skills because you're excited about that. You know they can bring something to the table with that, instead of challenging them. And then you kind of get the interview off track because you're, down a rabbit hole talking about something that's exciting to you about that candidate. So what happens in our organization is we train all of our hiring managers on these, and then we do deeper dive trainings for hiring managers, but also for people who are in the bias spotting type position. And we use case studies. We use real scenarios based on real situations. And we put our people through mock interviews where they act out those characters, they identify the assumptions. This is part of a piece of that 2-hour training that I mentioned. So we get people comfortable with starting to see patterns and assumptions. And so we actually provide a scenario. And then we say, not, can you name a bias in this scenario, but what assumptions are at play in this situation? And we unpack that scenario and then train people on what are the questions that we could ask to clarify biases and validate this information. And so we want to make sure that we have people who are comfortable and confident in doing that. And as an individual interviewer, as opposed to someone who is involved in changing a process, you really want to understand how to spot an assumption. Do we have the data to back that up is a question that should be something that we come back to every single time. Okay, questions. Let's see here. Are the data validators in the interview and or the debrief discussion? Yes, in the debrief discussion. So when everybody comes together to review, the data validators will be in that debrief discussion. Hopefully there is a talent acquisition partner who is guiding that. So helping the hiring manager along with the process. And that's the person who would naturally be in the room anyway. And so that person would just take on that role of being a little bit more involved to ask those questions and probe the reasons that people are asking certain questions or making certain assumptions. Do you share candidate resumes and application materials with the interview panel before the interview? Why or why not? Yes, we do. We want our interviewers to be familiar with who the candidate is and have at least a glancing knowledge of what the background and what their experiences are. And that is one of those things that also can help to make the interview feel a little bit more personal. as well, when the candidate doesn't have to, deep dive into the background from the very beginning. When you use the term standard interview, are you referring to an unstructured interview? Yes. Is there time for discussion after everyone has graded the candidate? Yes, there is. That's the debrief that I just talked about, where you'll have somebody who is a bias spotter in that debrief. And everyone will come together. And we try not to have people talk about the candidate outside of that, no side conversations. You put your notes in, you'll put your grade in, and then we'll all come together and talk about it. But we don't want people to be having side discussions about the candidates. Again, we don't want to sort of bias or influence people's perspectives outside of that more controlled setting. Let's see. Please help clarify the downside of providing interview questions ahead of time. This is counterintuitive to me. What is the downside? And then another question about that, would this contribute to non-equitable practice if certain individuals receive the questions beforehand versus others? So equity is about making sure that we are providing for people according to their needs. So it is equitable to provide for candidates who might need that additional time. However, the downside of providing interview questions ahead of time is that we want to ensure that we're getting a quality response from people that is not pre-prepared. And unfortunately, the reality is that with interview questions ahead of time, people will be able to manufacture responses that may not necessarily reflect the reality of a scenario. And if you look at the data, you'll see that many candidates do just that, even without questions in advance. So we want to make sure that we're creating a scenario where we're getting the highest quality answers that are most valid as far as the data we're receiving from that situation. And so we found that giving people a lot of information about how the interview process will unfold and what we're looking for will give them the confidence and the sense of security and reduce some anxiety. And then asking the questions in kind of a unprepared environment gives us the better quality data. And I apologize if I'm not getting to everyone's questions. There are so many questions. We've got, I'm looking at over 40, 45 questions. So I'm trying to grab them as we go through, but if I don't get to it, please feel free to email me. I'll share my email address after this. And if there's a question that you really wanted me to answer and I didn't get to, I'm really trying to get to them. Last key here as we wrap up, how to make and manage and measure that change. All right, a phased approach. I'm not going to get into this in great detail because you are going to receive the slides and you'll be able to review the details here on your own. But I do recommend a phased approach to this, where in the initiation phase, you largely focus on getting buy-in and collaboration from those who may not be as bought in on something like this. So ask them where their pain points are. Ask them what questions they would align to certain job competencies. Which job competencies are most important in their experience for success in the role. Really get them involved and invested in helping to weigh in on the changes in the process that you're trying to make, so that they see that there's some value there for them. This process of initiation, which is collecting the data, getting people's buy-in, getting their input, collaborating on what those competencies should be for different jobs, creating questions. We have a question bank that aligns to each competency. So an interviewer can actually, the hiring manager can go to that question bank and say, here's the competencies that we want to evaluate for this job. Here are, just grab a couple of questions that relate to those competencies. You certainly can, create other questions as long as they're used consistently from candidate to candidate as a hiring manager. But we try to make it as easy as possible and create those questions ahead of time, create and clarify an evaluation rubric, etc. So in the initiation phase, all of this is happening. This is back-end work that the majority of people in the organization won't be privy to. And this phase takes about 9 months. For us, it took, I think, a little longer. We had some other things that we were doing, but in this phase, it takes about 9 months to really get to that point where you have everything in order to start training people. So then you go into the education phase and you want to really give your hiring managers an understanding of why certain changes are happening, how you're supporting them with this process, how to run the process, walk them through the rubric, etc. All of that, that's the education phase. And then with the implementation phase, you may want to start with a pilot program and get feedback. You want to conduct hiring manager training and interview team training that's going to be a little bit more specific on understanding and seeing assumptions, and then count and track diverse slates. That's one of the many different things that we should be measuring in this process, but diverse slates is an easy one to start with. Other things that we might want to measure include taking some baseline metrics. I told you that it takes about 9 months to do that initiation phase and really get everything in place. And taking baseline metrics during that time can be really helpful in order to help you measure over time how you've progressed. So that might be the percentage of non-majority representation candidates who are currently in the hiring process at every phase. Maybe you want to collect that quarter over quarter for a few quarters as you're doing the initiation. Maybe you want to collect the percentage of diverse slates that you're seeing quarter over quarter for a few quarters as you're doing the initiation. The way that we started taking these baseline metrics in Clearway was for every job requisition that was closed, our talent acquisition partners, they would mark, job offer sent and job offer was accepted, filling everything out, closing the requisition. At the very end of that form, there was a question, was there a diverse slate for this role? Yes or no? And quarterly, we pulled those numbers to see where we were at as a baseline. And then once we implemented our changes, started looking at that as well, so that we could see, was there a change happening, and if so, where? And maybe there are certain departments or hiring managers who are particularly good at this right now, and we need to talk to them, or certain departments or hiring managers who are not doing as great, and we need to talk to them for different reasons, right? So looking into those things and really evaluating and understanding how that's working. Quick question I'm seeing is that question bank I referenced something that can be purchased somewhere or something we developed in-house? It's something that we developed in-house and was specific to our values and competencies. So that there will probably be for any given organization a number of questions that are pretty generic on, let's say, communication skills or leadership skills, or things like that you can pull. If you Google, you can find online list of questions to ask in an interview on communication skills, or on, a lot of these kind of more generic concepts. You can find some pretty good lists online, at least to get you started, and then clarify, condense, cull, make those questions what you want them to be. But there's a good bit of stuff that you can find if you just do a Google search on that. Okay. When we're talking about diverse slates or balanced slates, when I'm saying that the TA partner has to mark yes or no, there is one or there isn't one for this job requisition, we're talking about a slate where there is both diverse gender representation and ethnic representation on the final candidate slate. And statistically, you need 2 candidates who are non-majority candidates in order for there to be a chance that one of those people may be hired. Additionally, for example, a woman of color can't fill 2 spots. This is 2 separate people. And then you want to track the rate of balanced slates across the organization and by department and do a regular review of that. And once you have a structured interview process in place, you will be surprised at how having that additional layer of objectivity changes the composition of your talent pool. When we talk about targeting diverse slates with folks, the language that we use in this is important, I think, because people can understand a little bit more hiring managers specifically who maybe are like, I've been hiring for years and my process works because I have this great team. We want to make sure that we are responsive to those sort of concerns. And so this is sort of the framing that we use when we talk about this is, listen, we're using research to inform our hiring process to reach the best decisions. We're creating processes that are more fair. We're seeking to harness the benefits of diversity and inclusiveness in our company and create processes that will help us do that effectively. Again, this is process-oriented language. We're acknowledging that every human can take cognitive shortcuts that can be biased. And we're recognizing the use of culture add, whatever that means for your organization, but it should be clear, as a tie break between qualified candidates. It never means that we're going to hire someone unqualified. It doesn't mean that we have a quota per se for diversity hires. It doesn't mean that we're making decisions based on demographic factors alone. And sometimes you'll get that question of like, we care about diversity, but we want to make sure that we're not lowering the bar, right? And my response is always, I'm asking you to raise the bar. A lack of diversity is the first indication that a company isn't a meritocracy because talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. So really, we're trying to hold ourselves to a higher standard here and make sure that we're doing things in a way that really supports our desired outcomes. So what's next? If you want to make a start on this, evaluate your current interviewing practices. Do you know what the candidate experience is? What are the pain points? Do you have a mechanism for objective evaluation? How robust is it? How consistently is it used? How clear are the results that you get out of it? And some of you may have a version of this that you can kind of tweak and change a little bit to get it to something that's a little closer to what you might like. And others of you may want to kind of start from zero and reimagine the whole process. And both of those approaches are valid depending on your needs. Evaluate your metrics, take a baseline. It's really important to have baseline data so that you can measure your progress. And then, if you want to get in touch and continue the conversation, every organization is different. And the important thing is that within our organizations, we are consistent. We are as objective as possible. And we are providing people with the resources that they need to be successful over time and holding them accountable for using those resources. So hopefully this has given you some tools and some food for thought to take what is valuable to you in your organizations and use that. If there's something that was not valuable to you, don't feel any pressure to use it. Take what you can and implement what you can. And I would love to hear from you. If you want to continue the conversation, please reach out to me and let's talk. Thanks for having me. I'll turn it over to Mari to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Once again, a great session. Thank you for providing practical and actionable insights and for offering your emails so questions that we did not have time for today can get answered. We really appreciate that. For those in the audience, thank you for your engagement during this training. So lots of questions. Inclusive interviewing is just one piece to a larger discussion around creating a culture of inclusion and belonging. So I hope you will take what you learned today, share it with your coworkers and managers, and most importantly, put it into action. We will be sending out the recording. So if you want to watch this with some of your other colleagues, definitely do that, or just to revisit it again. So before you leave, please take a few minutes to send us your feedback. It will help us serve you better. The survey is being posted in the chat box right now. It will also pop up in your browser when you leave this webinar. Don't forget to register for Say Hey. It will be bittersweet as this will be my last Say Hey as Executive Director. So thank you all again for your great engagement today, and to Elizabeth, have a great day. See you next time. Bye.